The FCC's misclassification of RF radiation risks. The failure to recognize the non-thermal effects of RF radiation is akin to the historical resistance to accepting a heliocentric model of the universe. Just as society once clung to the geocentric view despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, the FCC and FDA have clung to outdated RF safety guidelines, disregarding evidence of biological interactions beyond thermal heating. Non-thermal effects, such as alterations in cellular signaling, oxidative stress, and disruptions to bioelectric communication, are increasingly supported by research. For instance, the National Toxicology Program, NTP, found clear evidence linking RF radiation to cancer in animal models. Yet, these findings have been largely ignored by regulatory agencies. With the recent lawsuit brought forward by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. revealing significant gaps in regulatory oversight, it's crucial to examine the positions of key policymakers, including FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr. In light of mounting scientific evidence and a pivotal 2021 court ruling, it is imperative to challenge FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr's documented complacency in addressing the non-thermal risks of radiofrequency, RF, radiation. While Carr's statements, made prior to the FCC's legal defeat in 2021, attempted to defend outdated safety standards, the courts have made it clear that these guidelines are insufficient to protect public health. New research only underscores the urgency for regulatory action. The 2021 lawsuit, spearheaded by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., revealed glaring inadequacies in the FCC's decades-old RF safety standards. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit ruled decisively that the FCC failed to justify its refusal to update safety guidelines, ignoring substantial evidence of non-thermal biological effects. This legal victory exposed the fallacy in Carr's prior assertions that the FCC's guidelines sufficiently protect public health. Complacency is no longer an option. Cancers and neurological disorders on the rise. The rates of glioblastomas, cardiac schwannomas, and other cancers linked to RF radiation are increasing globally. Simultaneously, neurological disorders like ADHD and autism, which may be influenced by bioelectric disruption from RF exposure, are becoming more prevalent. The myth of thermal-only risks. Carr's earlier defenses of the FCC's guidelines rest on the assumption that RF radiation is harmless below the thermal threshold. However, thousands of peer-reviewed studies now demonstrate non-thermal effects, including DNA damage, oxidative stress, disruptions to bioelectric signaling. Critical for cellular health suppression of independent science, regulatory inertia has stifled independent research and delayed policy changes. The 2021 court ruling invalidates any claim that ongoing FCC oversight is grounded in modern science. Instead, it reveals a troubling pattern of reliance on industry-biased studies. Carr's position hinges on the assertion that the FCC's RF safety guidelines, based on FDA evaluations, are sufficient to protect public health. However, the 2021 RFK Jr. lawsuit demonstrated that the FDA lacks updated, peer-reviewed research supporting the adequacy of these 25-year-old standards. Fact check. The FCC guidelines, established in 1996, are focused exclusively on the thermal effects of RF radiation. They do not account for non-thermal biological effects, which recent studies have increasingly linked to cancer, neurological disorders, and reproductive health issues. Court findings. The court ruled in favor of RFK Jr., emphasizing that both the FCC and FDA had failed to provide scientific evidence to justify their outdated safety standards. While the court ruling demanded updated guidelines based on current science, the federal government's response under the Biden-Harris administration was to cut funding for the National Toxicology Program study, a pivotal investigation that found clear evidence of cancer from RF exposure. NTP study findings. Clear evidence of cancer, such as gliomas and cardiac schwannomas, in rats exposed to RF radiation. Demonstrated biological effects at exposure levels comparable to those experienced by heavy mobile phone users. Ramazzini Institute confirmation. The RI study, conducted at lower power levels akin to everyday human exposure, reinforced the NTP findings, further validating the carcinogenic potential of RF radiation. Ramazzini Institute found that tumors caused by RF radiation in rats share striking morphological and genetic similarities with low-grade gliomas in humans, reinforcing earlier findings from the defunded National Toxicology Program, NTP, implication. The halting of NTP research represents a troubling move away from evidence-based policymaking, leaving critical questions about RF safety unanswered. Carr's continued endorsement of the FCC's 1996 guidelines ignores the mounting body of evidence pointing to non-thermal health risks. This stance is not only outdated but also at odds with the court's mandate, the legal ruling requiring the FCC to update its guidelines to reflect modern scientific understanding. New research studies like the NIHS-Ramazzini collaboration, which found that tumors in rats exposed to RF radiation shared genetic and morphological similarities with human cancers, strongly suggest the need for updated safety standards. Call to action. As FCC chair nominee, Carr must acknowledge the inadequacy of existing guidelines and commit to addressing the court-mandated updates rather than perpetuating complacency. Failing to revise safety standards in light of scientific advancements carries significant risks. Public health, rising rates of cancers and neurological disorders could be linked to prolonged RF exposure under outdated safety limits. Scientific suppression. The decision to halt NTP research reflects a broader pattern of stifling studies that could challenge entrenched industrial interests. Erosion of trust. The public's faith in regulatory agencies diminishes when evidence of harm is ignored or dismissed. Brendan Carr's documented positions on RF safety are increasingly incompatible with the realities of modern science. While the NTP and RI studies provide compelling evidence of non-thermal biological effects, the FCC's guidelines remain woefully outdated. This disconnect poses a direct threat to public health and undermines efforts to establish trust in regulatory oversight. As Carr's potential confirmation looms, it is imperative for policymakers and the public to demand accountability and adherence to scientific evidence. The FCC must prioritize the health of the American people over the interests of the telecommunications industry. The FCC's failure to update RF safety standards after a quarter-century of technological advancements is a glaring oversight with dire public health implications. Brendan Carr's pre-2021 positions, which sought to defend the status quo, are no longer tenable in light of legal rulings and robust scientific evidence. We call on Commissioner Carr to honor the court's mandate, respect the science, and take immediate action to update FCC guidelines. The health of the American people, especially children and vulnerable populations, depends on it. The time for complacency is over. The era of accountability and evidence-based policy must begin. Visit RF Safe to learn more.